problem of consciousness and physicalism. We have in the blue corner, David, and in the red corner, Benjamin. And the blue and the red doesn't mean anything. They're just two different colors to distinguish between these two different sides of the problem. I'm going to give them both the opportunity to introduce themselves to you. And then Benjamin's going to be taking the opening position with physicalism. So since you're going first, Benjamin, perhaps you could introduce yourself first of all.
Yes. First off, I want to thank you for having me on today. It's really nice to be invited to have these discussions. My name is Ben Watkins, and I am the host of Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from a non-theist perspective. And we try to contribute to dialogue within the philosophy of religion, giving that skeptical perspective.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So bringing next to your screen, David.
David, Hare Krishna, Shalom, welcome. Appreciate you having me on. I'm here in Metro Detroit, educational background in civil engineering. I'm kind of a landlord and a merchant. I actually sell books online. And I love philosophy, spiritual studies, meditation, and debate. I have a YouTube page, a regular weekly show with a woman called Church of Entropy, and I appear semi-regularly on debates and appreciate people that enjoy debate and trying to get to the bottom of important topics.
Epic and awesome. Thank you.
And you're also an engineer. So my undergraduate is in mechanical engineering. So this is kind of a mechanical versus civil engineering.
Well, hopefully we're both systematic thinkers, so hopefully.
Yeah. So I don't get to I'm sure you have a similar experience. Our engineering peers are not generally the most philosophical individuals. So to meet another engineer who's also into philosophy, this is super exciting.
Awesome. So Ben, you're first up, taking the I guess we could say the affirmative in this this debate / discussion. Is the existence of consciousness consistent with physicalism? And you might even take it further and say, exclusively dependent on physicalism and completely explained by it. But I'll let you make your opening statement and set the scene, set the stage for this and the kind of the scope of the discussion with your opening statement. Thanks, Ben. Take it away.
Okay, so to begin, so this is probably one of my favorite topics in the philosophy of mind. It's the mind-body problem. And so what I want to try to do in this opening is just kind of sketch what that mind-body problem is, some ways that we can approach it, and then how I approach it. And so to start off with the mind-body problem, the mind-body problem is a question about the relationship between our mental lives and the physical world. So problems arise when we draw a sharp distinction between mind and body. So if we can take four claims that form what's called an inconsistent tetrad. And what that means is that if any of the three of these claims are true, we can deduce the falsity of the fourth. So we can accept any of the three claims, but we have to reject one of them. And so the first claim seems obvious. The mind is a non-physical thing. The second claim is that the body is a physical thing. The third claim is the claim that the mind and the body interact. And the fourth claim is that a physical and a non-physical thing can't interact. So again, all four of these claims can't be true. So if the mind is a physical thing and the body if the mind is a non-physical thing and the body is a physical thing, and the mind and the body interact, then it must be false that a non-physical and a physical thing can't interact. Similarly, if it's true that a physical and a non-physical thing cannot interact, and it's true that the mind is a physical thing, and it's true that the mind and the body interact, then we can deduce the falsity of the claim that a mind is a non-physical thing. So there's two broad camps that tackle this mind-body problem. So the first camp is the dualist camp, and the second camp is the monist camp. And so the monist camp insists that there's only one fundamental kind of stuff, whereas the dualist insists, no, there's a sharp distinction between mind and body. So we're more than merely material. So Cartesian dualism or substance dualism is the view that minds and bodies are distinct substances. Because this view insists minds are non-physical substances, it's hard to understand how non-physical minds can causally interact with physical bodies. This is the interaction problem. It's also hard to understand why a non-physical mind cannot causally interact with some other physical body. This is the pairing problem. And so if we go into the other camp, the monist camp, the monists, they deny this sharp distinction between mind and body and instead insist on a simpler view of a single substance. So materialism or physicalism is the view that fundamental reality is physical. Because this view insists fundamental reality is entirely physical, it's hard to understand the irreducible nature of minds. We could know all the physical facts about the brain of a bat, but we would still not know what it is like to be a bat. We cannot fully explain the mind in physical terms. This is the hard problem of consciousness. So that's roughly the territory. So where should we start? How do we start to distinguish between these dualist and monist views? So I think there's three facts that that's where we start from. And so I guess you could say these are my presuppositions. So I presuppose from the start that minds are real and irreducible. So if it consciously seems to me like I'm conscious, then there is consciousness. So because appearance and reality coincide here, the distinction between them disappears. So there is a hard problem of consciousness. Minds are neither identical to nor reducible to brains. So I'm an anti-reductionist. So minds causally interact with physical brains. That's the second fact. We drink water because we are thirsty. The conscious mental state of being thirsty is what causes the body to drink water. There is good reason to believe there is a solution to the interaction problem. And the third fact is minds are features of particular brains. So the best explanation of facts about the relation between our minds and brains is that the minds necessarily supervene on physical things like the brains of vertebrae. So there's good reason to believe there's a solution to the pairing problem. So where does that leave me? Where am I at today? So my view is often called a form of non-reductive physicalism, or what I'm calling dual aspect monism. So this is an idea where I'm trying to combine the best of both camps. I'm trying to find a synthesis between the dualist camp and the monist camp. So according to dual aspect monism, the mind and body are two distinct ways of organizing or describing reality. This view denies that the mental and the physical are distinct substances like the dualist does. It instead claims mental and physical concepts are two inseparable and mutually irreducible perspectives or aspects of a single substance. This view avoids both the interaction problem and the pairing problem while also insisting the mind and the body are real and irreducible to one another. So the idea here is that mind and body are two sides of the same coin. We can describe bodies in completely third-person objective terms, but we're not going to be able to describe all of reality in those terms. We're going to have to appeal to an irreducibly subjective first-person perspective. That doesn't mean that there's an additional substance. It just means that we can't understand one concept within terms of the other, just like we can't look at both sides of a coin at the same time. So that's the analogy. So on this view, mental states are like conscious experiences, and personality are higher order biological functions, like photosynthesis or digestion, except they must appeal to that first person subjective experience. So that's broadly my view, my anti-reductionist physicalist view. That's sometimes called biological naturalism. It's sometimes called neutral monism. It goes by many different names. But that's the basic of it. So I'll go ahead and end right there. I don't know how I am for time. I hope I didn't go over. But hopefully that lays the groundwork and the concepts that we need to understand to help us throughout the rest of the discussion.
Awesome. You're all good for time, Ben. Thanks for that opening statement, setting the ground there, and presenting dual aspect monism is one way of looking at this consciousness and physicalism problem. So I'm going to pass it over to you now, David, for your opening statement on this topic.
Hey, thanks a lot, Josh, and Ben. I appreciate your explanation. You're prepared. I watched a good few hours of some of your other debates and just talks, so you definitely understand the issue well and frame it, and even help my own understanding of what it is that I believe. And as I say, I'm essentially a dualist. After I became a man, I went to Jerusalem and enrolled in yeshiva, and spent probably 2 hours a day praying, chanting Hebrew prayers for well over a decade, and then I picked up Bhakti Yoga, and I chant Sanskrit mantras. I enjoy doing rituals, and I studied the Talmud and the texts of the sages, and there's explanations for these rituals. Lord Jagannath behind me. I'm sure the similar deities all over the world, the Lord of the world, and the meaning behind the rituals are almost always explained within a dualistic system, that we say some special prayers or do some special ritual at the correct time, and it has some sort of effect, ramification in the spiritual realm, and that there's an interaction with the physical. And I say, yes, that is essentially what I believe, but I'm also a rationalist. I guess you're both engineers, systematic thinkers, and I knew in university, kind of the absurdity from a general understanding of the scientific method. But from my study of science, to me, I want to argue, so to say, against physicalism, that it is reasonable and even likely from a scientific perspective that consciousness, we would say the mind-body problem, just in the way that Benjamin framed it, which is probably the correct philosophical framing, mind versus consciousness. But I say that consciousness is not a phenomenon that arises from the material realm. It has another source, namely, the spiritual realm, and the various religious traditions and sages that have understandings, or anybody's own personal experience. Anybody could meditate. Everybody has a mind. Everybody has consciousness. So it's something that anybody could somewhat test with their own power of meditating, and even just mental techniques. A lot of atheists, pardon me, still do mental techniques, like mantras and various things, because they work. They help the mind perform better. So they explain, what is this mind? So I'm going to give generally two classical arguments that probably, Benjamin has good university training, has done his studies, maybe even could express these arguments better than I can. But I will argue first that the general state of science does not justify believing that the brain is capable of producing this mind or consciousness. And then added to that, I will argue the classical dualistic general argument, Plato's forms, similar to the ontological argument that ideas in general can't arise from the material realm. Like there are no perfect circles in the material realm, but the concept of the perfect circle exists. Therefore, perfect circles exist in some separate non-material realm, which is, I think, parallel to the ontological argument. I haven't watched. Benjamin had quite a long stream on that topic. So I'm not sure how much, I'm happy to get into the modern theories of the brain, but it would appear for over 100 years, like I was pre-med, I took undergraduate anatomy, God forbid, we dissected a corpse and saw the brain, and there's thought like the mind as a controller of the body. And then there's just the concept of thought in general. So like consciousness sometimes is divided in what possibly comes from the physical, what comes from the spiritual, besides for the framing that Benjamin gave, just if there is certain elements or an interplay between the two realms for different spiritual systems. So this concept of a me, the controller of the body, has what's called the heart problem of consciousness, is because there's really very little evidence that the brain is capable of producing this phenomenon of like a singular controller. In fact, the physical evidence points more towards randomized type hypothesis. Like Sam Harris would say, consciousness is relatively an illusion, that there is a voice in our head, but the illusion of making decisions, of like thinking that there's a me and I have multiple choices in front of me and good and bad to choose from, that's largely an illusion. That it's mechanistic processes of sense perception and chunking and various genetic factors, and even a question of free will is near impossible to come up with a physical model. And if you think how long we've been running the biology of the human body, understanding, people have been postulating modern science, microscope thought arising from the brain, really for a long period of time, and the discoveries of science in other fields, and mostly now they're just trying to map computer science and say, well, computers produce thought in a certain pattern, and therefore maybe the brain through electrical circuits. But relatively, there's no good model for how the brain produces even thought, let alone what will involve discuss what is consciousness. Is there the mind consciousness difference, the difference between the controller, the singular me that I believe is a unified force of this body, besides like mind, if thinking like when I do 1 + 1 = 2, or I remember Josh's name or Benjamin's name, or if think about pink elephants, that there's almost no evidence that thinking 1 + 1 = 2 is occurring in the brain. And so I would argue also that I, that in my head thinks about these topics, is also not occurring in the physical realm. So I guess that's a general presentation of, and I appreciate Benjamin because he does have a pretty formulaic understanding of this issue.
Awesome. Thank you for your opening statement, David. What a fascinating topic. It's not for everyone, but for those of us who are interested in considering and discussing these topics, this is it's an eternal conversation, really. People have been discussing this for literally thousands of years that we know of, and this conversation continues today. So having made both of those opening statements, I'd like to now open this conversation up to interlocution, to give you each the opportunity to respond to each other's statements and to ask questions or pose challenges. If you need to elucidate something, or if you have a challenge to bring against something that was presented. So I'll switch our view here to like a split screen so that we can have the two of you on, and I'll really just jump in if the to use an MMA analogy, fight goes to the floor and it starts to get boring, I'll stand both of you back up again. Otherwise, I'm just going to let you two gentlemen go for it.
You want me to go first because you were the affirmative, or either's fine?
Yeah, sure. You go ahead. Go first.
Yeah, so there's a whole territories of things that we could either get into or avoid. So like I tried to frame it neutral, where anybody who was part of any dualistic system would largely, somewhat agree with the structure of my arguments, even if we have different understandings of dualistic systems. And then there's also questions of morality and ethics. If you're a materialism that does nihilism a natural result in like I debated John Francisco Garepi, who is also a nihilist. So are you also a nihilist? And does physicalism is nihilism a natural conclusion of physicalism?
Gotcha. So I do not believe it is. I'm an anti-reductionist in the philosophy of mind, and I'm also an anti-reductionist in moral philosophy, or what's often called metaethics. So I'm what's called in the literature as an ethical non-naturalist. And so ethical non-naturalists assert that moral properties can't be reduced to non-moral properties. And so moral truths are what non-naturalists call irreducibly normative. What on earth does that mean? So it means that anytime we are going to state moral or ethical truth, we're going to have to make reference to a normative concept. A normative concept being a reason-implying concept, where a reason is a consideration that counts in favor of believing some way or acting some way rather than another. So to give an example, I think that future pain is bad. And I think that's an ethical truth. And I think it's true in the sense that future pain, the fact of what it's like to be burnt or whipped, gives us all sufficient reason to want to not to have those future experiences. And so that's an irreducibly normative truth. And so I don't think that this is a causal truth. This is the fact that pain is bad is like a mathematical truth or a modal truth. It's not a truth about the causal world. So the mind-body problem takes place within the causal realm because we're trying to say that minds and bodies causally interact. So these are things that are made of, physical matter or have some sort of spatial extension and location. Whereas reason-implying truths like moral truths are abstract. So they're like, in that sense, they're like mathematics. So if someone were to ask, well, where does morality come from? It doesn't come from anywhere because it's an abstract thing. Moral truths are abstract things. And come from is a causal relation. It suggests it's something that exists within the causal world, whereas at one time something was the case, then at another time that wasn't the case because it came about. That idea of causation just isn't applicable to the kind of fact that moral facts are. So the ethical non-naturalist, the central thesis is nothing more than Hume's is-ought gap. There's a realm of is facts where is includes causal facts, but there's also this realm of ought facts, of reason-implying facts, where things count in favor of having certain beliefs or acting in certain ways, the logical space of reasons. And so we can call the logical space of reasons and the causal world the realm of law, or the realm of natural law. So if we ask the question, how does mind fit into natural law, we can see that we're asking a question about the realm of law. We're not asking a question about the logical space of reasons. So does physicalism, a view within the realm of law, imply moral nihilism, a view about the logical space of reasons? No, those are just separate domains of facts. Like facts about mathematics don't imply facts about sonnets, because they're just different categories of fact.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, it's a little off topic. Just I was curious if you had nihilist leanings, or if you explain your belief system. And I guess we all have Eastern leanings here, so called like the ahimsa principle of limiting pain. That there's an accepted axiom, the ahimsa principle, that there's a positive thing to limit suffering, and how you derive the origin of it, or even to argue whether from a physicalist perspective you could derive the ahimsa principle, might be semi off topic, just the pure question of consciousness. So I put to you two levels of the I, like, I mean, you don't have to divulge any of your personal beliefs, but if you're a believer in the soul, or things like reincarnation, or mantra meditation, or rituals, that there, so to say, there is a effect that you could say a prayer, do a ritual, and it has some sort of supernatural, super physical effect beyond the material realm, like prayer, that you could pray and it works, not just a placebo effect, but some sort of metaphysical. And I guess there are possibly some physicalists that also might try to explain certain physical explanations for why spiritual phenomenon might work, or you largely rejecting it. You'd be respectful, basically, like, no, I'm sorry, your ritual doesn't work, your prayer doesn't work.
Okay, I'm not muted, am I?
We hear you fine.
Sweet. Okay, cool. Mic check. So I want to start with the idea of souls. So the idea of souls implies this form of substance dualism, this idea that there's this entirely non-physical mind that can survive a physical death and exist independently of any physical change whatsoever. So I will go ahead and lay my cards on the table and say that I don't believe in a soul. In fact, I think that we have good arguments for the conclusion that there probably aren't non-physical minds such as a soul. But I think that raises some other very interesting questions, because I'm an anti-reductionist about the mind, and I'm an anti-reductionist about ethics. Am I an anti-reductionist about personal identity? And it turns out I'm not. I'm actually a reductionist about personal identity. I know it might sound a little weird, but I think that there are good reasons to believe that there isn't this ghost in the machine. There isn't this Cartesian theater, this place kind of behind your eyes, and that's irreducible, such that it makes you the same person through time. So, I certainly remember being a child. I'm certainly not a child anymore. But what fact about me makes it the case that those experiences were me? Or what fact about my continued existence is going to make it the case that some person in the future will be me? That's a question. And so I think that the right view in there is a reductionist one, where personal identity is reduced to the idea of psychological continuity. So this idea that we can have certain experiences, and as long as they're connected in the right ways through time, we can say that this relation R, psychological connectedness, is this person. And that's what makes persons the same through time. Now, might be getting a little too in the weeds to go into the argument as to why that is, but the point I'm trying to make is that part of my physicalist view here is going to imply something like a reductionist view about personal identity, and it is going to imply that there aren't these disembodied minds that we call souls or demons or angels or even gods. So that is a very important implication, I think, of the kind of monist view that I have, in which I don't have the resources that your dualist view would have, in the sense that if you're trying to answer these questions of personal identity, you might say, well, I have access to this irreducible fact, mind fact that makes it, the same person through time. I just don't have that resource, whereas something like a substance dualist view would have that resource.
So does that mean that prayer and ritual doesn't work any more than a placebo effect according to your worldview?
So this is going to have to do with my views in the philosophy of religion. So it depends on what you mean by prayer and ritual. So if prayer is meant to be like incessory prayer, where you're praying for some causal event to happen in the world, I don't think prayer works like that. However, if you're talking about prayer or ritual in the sense of a meditation, where it's a turning of the attention from outward inward, then I think prayer does work. I think there are the prayer is more for the person doing the praying than it is for anyone that they're praying about. It's a way of mental enlightenment. It's a way of I'll go ahead and stop.
And what about general karma? Because I don't know if you have Eastern leanings, but like the tree falls in the woods and no one's there. But if a crime's committed and the person gets away with it, is there some sort of spiritual extra collection, what we call karma, that you can't just be a bad person and get away with it because what comes around goes around, or what goes around comes around? Or is that a fallacy in that you can do bad things and get away with it because there is no superimposed karmatic system as part of physical reality?
So I believe that the universe is indifferent to the desires, wants, dreams, hopes of humanity. So no, I do not believe that there is this cosmic justice or this force that we'll call karma that helps balance ethical scales. I don't think that there's any sort of cosmic judgment that ensure, or even action that tries to ensure that self-interest and morality are aligned. So I think injustice is a real feature of the world. I think bad things happen to good people, and I think good things happen to bad people because the universe is indifferent. And that if there's going to be any justice in the world, then it's going to have to be brought about by conscious moral creatures like ourselves.
But I mean, are there systems or schools that do derive karma from physicalism, or is it basically philosophically, logically impossible to derive karma from physicalism?
I don't want to
say the ahimsa principle that you could derive like a ahimsa type general limiting suffering principle from physicalism. Let me
be modest here then and say that I just don't know, because there might very well be traditions that appeal to, there might be Taoist traditions or Buddhist traditions that are physicalist, one of the pillars in Buddhism is that the no self view that I just described, the reductionist view of personal identity. So there might very well be these traditions that have this monist view of reality, but appeal to some other principle like you were describing, like karma, and derive them from something else. I don't know. I'll go ahead and say that my Eastern philosophy exposure is limited. It needs to be more. Perhaps in that journey, I will find something like that.
You had any questions for me, or I could keep pounding you and we could go further with, but
No, fair enough. So you're firmly in the dualist camp. You have traditions, rituals. You've been brought up in these stories. They're intricately woven into this dualist tradition. And so the kind of thorn in the dualist side is the interaction problem, the idea that non-physical things and physical things can interact. So, or they can't interact. Why is that? What motivates this interaction problem? According to causal closure of the physical, non-physical events that causally interact with the physical world must be at least physically dependent. Otherwise, they couldn't have any physical effects. But why think the universe is causally closed? We get that answer from the first law of thermodynamics, which is also called the conservation of energy. So the idea that energy can be neither created nor destroyed, rather it can only change form from one form to another. So the net total energy in an isolated system remains constant through time. So the energy from a physical brain cannot causally interact with non-physical minds to reduce the net total of its own energy, and vice versa. So according to the interaction problem, physical and non-physical things cannot causally interact without deviating from the conservation of energy, which seems super implausible. But then again, similar claims would apply to abstract objects, like I was describing earlier, like ethical truths, because they wouldn't have mass, energy, nor spatial extension. So the conservation of energy is at least one reason to think that non-physical and physical things just can't interact, because you would have to violate this law of nature, the conservation of energy. Is the conservation of energy something that worries you in your dualistic view? How do you approach the interaction problem? And I know that you could write a whole book on this, so I'll go ahead, take all the time you need.
Because I was trained in ritual, and I actually train other people. I love doing rituals. I made my YouTube page to teach people how to do rituals and say certain prayers, and I studied the text behind them. So there are like Kabbalistic systems. There's traditions from sages that have dualistic explanations for how and why, so to say, these things work. And if you go to a rabbinic school, or if you go to probably any seminary of any religion, there's going to be rituals, and there's going to be prayers, and there's going to be so to say, the accepted sages that have the explanations of the rituals and the prayers, and those are largely dualistic, and a lot of those come from hundreds of years ago. And so something like the interaction problem, so Arjun even put it in the description here. I'm proposing what I call the multiple truth hypothesis. And when you opened up and you laid out the different possibilities, and you said they can't both be true at the same time, and saying like, yes, they can, even though they're contradictory. Yes, they can both be true at the same time. And it is somewhat kind of like Talmudic. There's even a joke in Fiddler on the Roof like that, where it's like, you're right, you're wrong. I mean, you're right. And another guy's like, no, you're right.
Exactly.
And another guy's like,
reference.
You can't both be right. And you're saying that you're right also. And you're saying everybody's right. But from like a Kabbalistic Judeo system, the sages have the tendency to just be like, everybody's right, everything's one. And even though it's dualistic, that the physical arises from the spiritual, and it's very complicated. Like it's the first Lubavitch Rebbe. A lot of people believe that he was of the opinion that the physical world is an illusion. That to solve the interaction problem, you have to go as far as to say the physical world doesn't actually exist. And there's schools in Hinduism also, like the gunas and the modes of maya. The word for the physical reality is maya, and it's made up of illusion, passion, and goodness. And to some sages might say it doesn't actually exist, or some sort of interaction. But in terms of, so to say, karma, to some extent, it may not be physical at all. So say, okay, there's karma, like God forbid if one person kills another person, one person does a grievous act, and there has to be some sort of justice, that it isn't actually anything to do with the physical realm, that it was a blemish to the soul, and the interaction of the spiritual realm into the material realm doesn't affect any of the balances of thermodynamics or the laws of physics. It's a like God forbid, like a reincarnation problem. A week in review, we talked about one person kills one person, and then therefore in the next life he has to be reborn, and then the other person kills them, and then the cycle keeps on repeating due to some sort of karmatic justice. And there's stories like that in the Vedas and the Talmud. And so, hopefully this is the next topic we're going to get into, the mind-body problem of what is the mind and what is the interaction. So if there is a conscious controller, that there's a me that has the ability to control what this body does, and then there's a spiritual realm that judges the karmatic consequences of the decisions that I make. So in the physical realm, any decision that me, the conscious controller of this body, makes has to comply to the physical laws. In some dualistic systems, we believe in magic, and you could supersede anybody who is part of any religious tradition. There's a lot of sages who, so to say, believe in magic, that you could supersede the physical laws. But the majority of the sages are relatively rationalist, and you can't supersede the laws. But you're saying that karmatic consequences, moral consequences of actions, are not actually something that are part of the physical realm. And how the spiritual consequences of what goes around comes around. If you give a quarter to a pauper and then you get blessed in a different way, or if you're nice to somebody and somebody else is nice to you in some sort of karmatic system, that doesn't have to have any problem with the interaction of the physical laws. And I'm happy to go deep into this, and then I want to eventually come to the argument that even this thought process, like not just like the controller of this body that decides what I do with it, in a spiritual realm that has some sort of judgmental consequences, you will call karma, that are meted out in a reaction to that. I'm claiming that the mind doesn't even exist in the physical body. Like I could prove that you have a soul, because when I ask you what 2 + 2 is, and if you answer 4, that didn't happen in your body, that I'm proclaiming that happened not in the physical realm.
So I want to also get clear on, because you said that you were going to give 2 arguments for dualism. And so the first had to do with science, and the second one you said was kind of an ontological argument, similar to Plato's forms. So how do we characterize those arguments, and where does the argument that you're putting on the table now, how does that fit into them, just so that we're clear?
Okay, well, I have my belief systems, and different people have belief systems in dualistic systems. So I'm just, for the sake of debate in justifying my belief, I'm proposing arguments, and I've done some research, and I watch videos, and I read books, and but they're largely justifications or that I give to myself for being a believer. That and that's as a philosopher, debater from the physicalist school, that's I thought enjoyable for the audience. And I'm more a Hasidic Jew. I like Eastern practices, but saying that theology unleashed, as devotees of Krishna or Hindus, would also largely agree with the arguments that I'm framing. And I don't have a educational background in philosophy like you do. To like I've read some Plato, and I may not correctly be quoting this stuff, and I apologize if I'm not.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. So I just trying to help parse out some of the claims that you've been making, so that I better understand them, because I'm super interested in because you're coming back to the question that you were posing to me that last time, or at least you seem like you were putting forward an argument of, if I ask you what 2 + 2 is, and you say 4, then I know that happened in your mind, and that event, that cognition, that judgment didn't occur in a material world. It occurred in a spiritual world. So it seems like your argument is that if this event happens, which obviously it can happen, that implies the substance dualism that you are defending tonight. Is that more or less the argument you were putting forward?
Yeah, I think that's Plato's forms argument that parallels the ontological argument. If I'm wrong about that, but the pink elephant argument, or the perfect circle, or even the concept of a chair, however you frame it, like the idea of a chair.
Plato, so now you got me. Now you got me in the game. So yeah, in Plato's writings, Socrates describes this view that's often called Platonism. And it's often very misunderstood. And it's very misunderstood because it's not entirely clear what Plato and his student Aristotle, who wrote about it later, exactly what they were trying to say. And it seems like Plato might have been confused about a few of the things he said. Plato saw this theory of forms as saying that there's like this realm of abstract objects. And so that there's, if there's this perfect pole vaulter, then there's this form of a perfect pole vaulter. Or if there's this form of a circle, there's this, that's because there's this perfectly instantiated circle. And so that's not really where modern contemporary people who call themselves Platonists have in mind. They think that Plato's view might be confused, that there are these properties that universals have, that this nature of abstract objects, but they don't imply that this something is instantiated. There isn't, there aren't circles because there's this perfect form of a circle that exists in some ethereal, non-temporal, non-spatial realm. What someone like me, who's an ethical non-naturalist, would say, look, there are universals. There are facts that are not about anything in particular. There are facts about abstract objects that are universal. So to give an example, I think that yellow is a color, and that the truth that yellow is a color requires that there be universals yellow and universals color. So those, I think those are, those aren't about a particular thing. Universals are things that particular things have. And so that's how we can conceive of Platonism. So I don't know if modern day Platonism gets you the substance dualism that you want, because again, the modern Platonic sense is going to say that these abstract truths, these truths about abstract objects, are non-causal. So they just don't stand in causal relations with things in the physical world. And so just one of the things that I assumed with the mind-body problem is, look, the minds and bodies do causally interact. The number 2 doesn't causally interact with anything. The facts about circles don't cause anything, but my mind causes things. I'm thirsty. My mind sends signals saying, hey, thirsty. And I have a physical event, and that causes mental effects to stop happening. So I think it's pretty clear that mind and body causally interact. So that's what I would say about that view. Now, there's the other argument that I think it was the first argument you presented tonight. It was this idea that science hasn't shown that minds can generate consciousness. Do you want to
I should have framed it better. If I put it better.
Please do that now. Take a moment and.
Well, I think, okay, yeah. I was trained in a dualistic system. I promote a dualistic system. I believe in a dualistic system. I'm educated enough in my own text to know that, my ancestors and the sages of previous generations were largely, dualist. And so Spinoza was excommunicated largely due to rejecting dualism, and to some extent that excommunication still stands because dualism is so important to Judaism that the writ of excommunication on Spinoza still stands because we're dualists. It's important. And but for all people, all traditions, it appears that almost all natural religions besides the major Abrahamic, but Hinduism or various belief systems around the world are largely dualistic. And even the Greeks and Socrates argues for the immortal existence of the soul. And science comes along, the concept that mind arises from the physical is relatively a new one. So Ben's an educated person who's read probably the ancients, and he knows largely how people had written about how they perceived and saw the world over thousands of years of historical progression. But physicalism is largely became a dominant school just in the last few hundred years. So the burden of saying what our ancestors and the majority of sages from almost all traditions proposed for thousands of years happens to be wrong, because now there's science and now we've solved this mystery and it actually comes from the brain. And so put the burden of proof and say that no, science has had a few hundred years now working with this postulation that consciousness and thought arises from the brain, and it's largely been a failure. And I mentioned consciousness studies in modern universities, part of Dr. Hamerov is an anesthesiology. Consciousness only has a scientific application to anesthesiology. So God forbid someone gets beat up, or someone in an accident, they become unconscious. The controller of the body. They no longer control their body at a physical level. So medically, scientifically, that's basically the only thing that we ascribe to consciousness. So the models of how thought comes to the brain is largely just a wild belief system that for 100 years now people have believed that we're going to come up with some sort of explanation for how consciousness arises from the brain. And so arguing it hasn't came up with the answer, and due to the fact that almost all world traditions and the greatest minds of previous generations were dualist, that we should go back to dualism.
Okay, so I guess I'll pick up here and stick with the philosophical tradition that I'm familiar with, which is the Western philosophical tradition that largely begins with Descartes. And so Descartes being where we get the term Cartesian dualism from. And so the conversation of what science has said about the nature of consciousness really starts with Descartes. So I guess I'll try to sum up the empirical case, the monist case, for why we should be, some of the things that lead us towards this monist conclusion, and to forego the Jewish tradition that David was just characterizing. I think that'll be the best way to go from here. So I'll start with the idea of an inference to the best explanation. So there's various facts from different domains in which there's observations that seem like they would be more probable if some form of monism was true than if some form of dualism was true. So to start, we can start in neuroscience. So one of the neuro findings we've found in neuroscience is that all known mental activity is correlated with physical changes in embodied brains. So damage, what do I mean by this? So damaging a brain can impair mental functioning and psychological capacities like personality, memory, or the capacity to have any conscious experiences at all. So this raises a question. Why does physical damage to a brain have any effect on mental functioning? Additionally, the impairment of certain psychological capacities is correlated with damage to specific regions of the brain, e.g., for example, dementia. So why is there this strong correlation? How come, I can predict what sort of experiences you're going to have by manipulating specific points in the brain? So that's one line of thought from neuroscience. Another one comes from genetics, which I find this one the most interesting personally. And that's the idea that minds and their psychological traits are physically related from one another. The probability of a mind having certain psychological traits, like dementia, is determined by genetics. So this makes sense if minds are physically dependent, but this fact is surprising if we suppose minds are independent of anything physical. So why are the psychological traits of some non-physical minds related through physical genetics? I think the monist has a good answer here, but I think the dualist is going to have issues here. And the last one I'll mention, because I know I'm probably running out of time, is from morphology. And so this is the idea that the complexity of mental capacities in any animal species is correlated with the complexity of their brains. So non-human animals have similar mental properties. This fact makes sense if minds are physically dependent, but it's surprising if we suppose minds are independent of anything physical. Do non-human animals have non-physical minds or immaterial souls? Why suppose Homo sapiens have non-physical minds or souls, but non-human animals do not? These are interesting questions that, why does there seem to be this physical, we know of nothing physical, mental happening without something physical happening? This observation is just more plausible on the monistic view than it is on the dualistic view. And so in combination with something like the interaction problem, where we've got reasons to think that this dualistic, causation can't really happen, that's largely the scientific case against dualism. They'll point to the fact that, look, how do you not violate conservation laws? How do you solve something like the pairing problem? And then how do you explain all these other observations that we get from like neuroscience and genetics and morphology? So that's largely the case. I'll go ahead and give the floor back to you, because I'm sure you got a lot.
Well, I have plenty of time. So, I mean, if you have to, however much time you have is, you're fine. But if, I'm not an expert in biology. I was pre-med, but didn't follow that path. But there's correlates. We call the neural correlates of consciousness and thought that like we're speaking right now, and we know the Broca's area or the control of the muscles that in certain parts of the brain that will light up. And I took neuropsychology at Stony Brook, and I had to do experiments for the class. I had to do like so many hours of lab experiment, and they stuck the probes on my head, and they flashed certain colors or words on the screen, and they read out where my mind was lighting up, and even like one where they opened my eye and had like an eye sensor and showed me pictures on the screen, God forbid, like in a Clockwork Orange or something like that. But it was a voluntary experiment that I had to take because I took a neuropsychology class at Stony Brook, and I'm glad I did. But yeah, there's a connection between the mind and the brain that you could see, but there is no explanation of a simple phenomenon like that we agree to call the color pink and recognize that this is the same phenomenon, or Josh or Arjun, that we're referring to the same person by the same name, that we don't actually have an explanation for how that occurs. You say probably occurring in the brain, and if it's something like the rest of the body, like the heart and pumping blood and oxygen and like the viruses and complicated factors, that we've had a long time to produce an explanation. So just parts of the brain lighting up, and even a computer. We have iPhones that I'm a competitive chess player, and a little computer, tiny iPhone, could destroy me at chess. We know how the computer operates, and a supposition that the mind operates in a similar way to the computer is probably false. And so we say, okay, because the computer, through logic gates and circuits and various things, could produce mathematics and logical, the computer programming, all the wonderful technology we have today, doesn't necessarily mean that the brain does it. And so I would, was saying that we know quite a bit about the brain. We know things are lighting up. And so I believe in, different things, and we're not here to discuss my beliefs, like the brain is a receptor, quantum consciousness, the brain as some sort of receptor, like Descartes, believe the pineal gland, the Talmud and the Vedas also kind of point to like the pineal gland as a sort of transmission between the two realms. But yeah, I would have some sort of belief in line with the classicist of the brain being some sort of receiver, and to put it back on the scientist, like I want more than a few areas of the brain lighting up. I want an explanation for how the brain produces 1 + 1 = 2.
Awesome. So now that I guess we're getting probably pretty close to the end, do we want to go down the rabbit hole of the issue of free will now? Because I'm sure people in the audience have questions of free will. And did you have any points you wanted to press on free will? Because I'm a compatibilist about free will, so I can lay out kind of the compatibilist view. But are you an incompatibilist when it comes to free will? What do you think they're important objections to a monist/physicalist view here?
I'm not a philosopher like you are, so I mean, you have better technical training, and I appreciate you're talking with us, even if we, you're representing opposition to, even my belief system and the belief system of the channel. But for the sake of argument and saying that, yes, I know that I believe things that your average person doesn't believe. I believe in reincarnation. I believe that saying mantras and prayers or doing rituals has certain karmatic ripple effects and various things. And I try to live my life according to this belief system. So my explanation, understanding of free will. But yes, I do make the argument quite often that as a physicalist, it's unlikely that free will exists. And I've even done a lot of these studies are on chess players, but the data appears from a physicalist perspective that there's a part of the brain that produces narratives that's different from the part of the brain that they supplicate makes decisions. So if you ask a person, why did you do that? And they tell you why they do that there's been certain psychometric tests that demonstrate that the explanations we give for why we do things don't actually match why we do it, because different areas light up in the brain. Not that they have some sort of direct mapping method, but just saying that when people do things, one area lights up, and when you ask them why they did it, a different area lights up, and they've designed certain ingenious psychometric tests to somewhat demonstrate that the explanation people give for why they do things don't match why they do it. But yes, I would put that as a person who's proposing to do things that your modern rational university system might think is ridiculous, like chanting Hare Krishna. Like, do you really think chanting Hare Krishna makes a difference? And you're saying yeah, I'm a believer in mantras in the spiritual realm, and because your average person in the modern impersonal secular realm, whatever the historical reasons why current society is, atheism, the plague on the West is facing from a certain perspective, that I would argue free will is one of the strongest arguments why to be a believer, and because it's very difficult to explain how this phenomenon that most people believe exists without the addition of some sort of spiritual, non-personal controller, non-material controller of the body.
Cool. So I guess I'll just settle for sketching out my compatibilist view from here. So what does all this mean? What are the implications or fears from free will as far as this monist view that I'm trying to characterize? So the key concept in free will is what's called the principle of alternative possibilities. So it's this idea that our wills are not free unless we could have done otherwise. So could have done otherwise. We need this coherent sense of could have done otherwise. And so if determinism is true, then we could not have done otherwise because our acts are inevitable. That's the claim. That's what's supposed to follow from determinism, where determinism is understood as an event like a choice or an act that's determined. It's determined when prior conditions like fate, the foreordained acts of a god, or antecedent physical causes in the brain and the laws of nature are sufficient condition for an event occurring. And so the fear is that physicalism implies this hard determinism where, we could not have done otherwise because our acts are inevitable. And so then it would follow that if determinism is true, then our wills are not free because our acts are inevitable. And that's just fatalism. And so the fear is that physicalism, or the monism I'm characterizing here, has this implication. And that no, our wills are free because we could have done otherwise. So therefore determinism is false. And we need to question this assumption of physicalism because it has this implication of hard determinism. So how do I avoid this? How do I avoid this incompatibilist reasoning? And so what I am is a compatibilist. I believe that free will and determinism are compatible, that there is a coherent sense of could have done otherwise that doesn't require us to break the laws of nature or to rise above the antecedent physical causes in our brains. So I think that freedom evolved. So it used to be the case that the Earth would be hit by an asteroid. That was inevitable. It was just inevitable. In fact, it happened. It destroyed the dinosaurs. But now people are here, and it's no longer the case that it's inevitable that the Earth will be struck by an asteroid. We could conceivably do an Armageddon-type engineering project, however difficult that might be, in which we go up into space and deflect an incoming asteroid. So it used to be the case that it was inevitable that the Earth would be struck by an asteroid, but it's no longer the case that it's inevitable that the Earth will be struck by an asteroid. Well, what happened? And I think the right answer to that question is that freedom evolved. The freedom to give rise to alternative possibilities and be more in control of our future events is that's the very thing. We're free in a way no bird is free. We're free because we have a higher ordered decision-making processes. It's all causally determined. Causal determinism is true, but it's just false that physicalism implies hard determinism, such that the future is inevitable. Future is not inevitable. We have the ability to make free decisions in the way that no bird has the ability to make free decisions. But this doesn't require us to break the laws of physics. So that's roughly the compatibilist view in the free will debate. This is a huge rabbit hole, and David and I have in not any way had the last word on it. So I encourage all the listeners to go join me in this deep, deep rabbit hole.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation, and I don't know if you want to give like a closing words, and we're going to take questions.
Yeah, let's take some questions. I talked first. If you want to give a few closing remarks, you can. I didn't have a closing prepared or anything. I don't really know what more I would say other than just recharacterizing my views. So I'm cool for whatever. I say we just wing it. We'll see how many questions we have.
Are you still there, Josh?
I am indeed still here. Fascinating conversation. Let me just recenter myself here so that I'm not kind of like half a face on the internet. Okay, questions. Yeah, we've been getting questions from the audience, and I actually have a question myself. I'd like to abuse my position as the moderator to throw my question in there.
I'll allow it.
Thank you. This is from real early on in the presentation, and I don't know if it was in your opening statement, Ben, or shortly afterwards. You said that, actually, I can check. I was taking notes. Yeah, okay, it was in your opening statement, the dual aspect monism. You made this very interesting statement that the mind and the body are two distinct ways of organizing reality. So your claim is that the mental and physical worlds or representations, they're two inseparable and irreducible aspects of the same thing. I've been listening to Donald Hoffman's book called The Case Against Reality. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but he makes a similar kind of...
I'm familiar with him, and I'm familiar with the book indirectly. I haven't read the book from cover to cover, but I've read several things about it. I've read a couple excerpts.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hear some echoes of similar thoughts there. But here's my question about this. So you made the point that there's in the dualist view that David is espousing, he has the benefit of this irreducible element, this separate irreducible element that he can use to explain the system, which is not available to you as like a go-to, feature. But in the presentation that you made of your dual aspect monism, it sounds to me like I can actually hear that your explanation relies on that irreducible aspect implicitly as a hidden variable. And what I mean by that is that when I hear you say that, there's like this first person perspective consciousness of these two different representations, I'm just left with like, what is perceiving it? If the mind and body are two distinct ways of organizing reality, what's organizing reality and what's experiencing these two different ways of organizing reality? It seems as though that irreducible thing is still in there. It's just like now we're just not gonna mention it.
No, it's absolutely right. I think it's a very, very good observation. Great question. Because you're right, this is part of the tension that starts to happen because like I said, I'm an anti-reductionist in the philosophy of mind. I believe that minds are irreducible. So what do I mean? I don't have these resources to, I think I was saying it in the context of personal identity earlier, where the substance dualist has this irreducible substance to appeal to. So the dualist is going to say that there's these two irreducible substances in the world and that they causally interact. Whereas the monist is going to say, no, there's just one kind of stuff, but we have to describe it in two different ways. And so what concepts we have to use is going to be this interplay between a first person perspective that's irreducibly subjective, the what it feels like to eat strawberries, the what it's like to have a thought. This irreducible first person language game that we have is essential. It's irreducible. We can't get rid of it by describing it entirely in third person objective terms that don't make reference to this irreducible subjective quality. Similarly, we can't describe all of objective reality in mere first person terms. Neither of these language games are reducible to the other. We have to see them, but we have to have them both. But we cannot we can't reduce one side to the other. I use the analogy of a coin because it helps us see, like, if you look at the phenomenology of a coin, you can only look at one side at a time. You can't reduce one side to the other side. You can only just flip it over. The similar with there's only one coin, just like there's only one reality. It just has two aspects. One aspect you can see from a third person perspective. But if you try to go entirely third person perspective, you'll lose that subjective perspective. Just like if you tried to describe a coin using only one side, you'd leave out the other side of the coin. You'd leave something out. And if you tried to describe all of third-person reality in first-person terms, you'd leave something out. Again, you can't describe the one coin without referring to both sides. Yeah, it's a very mind-bendy view. It's the view of, for those who are familiar with the rationalist tradition, Spinoza and Einstein, and even Bertrand Russell at one point. There's Russellian monism, this view is often called, and it's held more contemporarily by people like Thomas Nagel in his work, The View from Nowhere. And part of that book, what he's trying to do is to help us understand better this interplay between the third person perspective and the irreducible first person perspective. It's a great question. Super, super difficult to answer. Super mind-bendy idea.
Great
questions.
job.
These are them.
Yes. Okay, so questions from the audience here.
Looks like they're all for Ben, but go ahead.
Oh no, they're not all for Ben. I think this one here. I think
there's quite a few for Ben. You could go ahead and keep asking him.
I got a good one for both of you, but this one, I think you just answered this one, Ben. You seem to try to reconcile some contradictions inherent with monism or physicalism. What's your position, or do you not want to commit yourself? I think you just pretty much answered that one, right? And you pointed to a number of thinkers.
I think that there's the risk of alienating myself. I'm what's called a Hegelian, so I'm very influenced by Hegel's thought, and so I'm very tempted by this idea of synthesis, to find two ideas that are kind of warring between each other, and to take the strengths from both views and leave their weaknesses behind, so that you have this kind of strong synthesis. So I want to take the strengths of dualism, because it seems like there's this irreducibly kind of dual, two-way part about the world that we have to account for, but that there's also this unity, this oneness of, there's only one reality, and that everything is connected. And so but there's, the hard problem of consciousness arises on monism, the interaction problem on dualism. So how can we combine these views and get one that avoids both of these problems? And that's what I'm trying to achieve with the non-reductive physicalism or the neutral monism.
Okay, in that case, I'm calling this a follow-up question. Brute Facts Podcast wants to know, Ben, why aren't you a theist yet?
The problem of evil. The problem of hiddenness, religious disagreement, the physical dependency of minds, biological evolution. Those are the reasons.
Okay. We should get you back on the podcast to discuss the problem of evil in that case. As the first
Epicurean trilemma. I actually did a lot of research in you talk monads and Leibniz and the calculus I mentioned quite often.
Leibniz is wonderful to read.
But I was saying calculus was actually partially designed to answer the Epicurean trilemma, and in terms of the most perfect outcome that in reality what we see is the most perfect outcome. And so Leibniz actually, like Newton, created calculus to try to describe the connection between position and movement. Leibniz developed the calculus largely to try to solve the Epicurean trilemma, the problem of evil.
Independently of Newton too. It's just so wild to me that they were able to just go in a room and just invent calculus.
Yeah, I mentioned that because all engineering study calculus, but calculus is largely like Cartesian, is largely an explanation to try to understand how the spiritual and material realms interact. And so I'm sure Josh and Arjun, we like to believe in the science of karma. And from a physicalist perspective, you're saying, well, karma doesn't really exist. I'm sorry. And you're saying, well, I believe karma exists. And I also believe I could take a scientific approach to karma.
As a hypothesis, if nothing else, right? You could construct a hypothesis, and you would probably have to introduce this irreducible identity which is non-material and, goes between different bodies. You'd have to introduce that as a variable, and then maybe devise experiments to look for its existence. But we definitely have to do the problem of evil in calculus. That's going to be awesome. Okay, here's a question for both of you. Given that Theology Unleashed is basically the UFC of ideas, there's questions from the Church of Entropy. They're asking, what's the best evidence in support of your position? They're asking for the knockout, the KO punch.
She's my streaming partner, so if Ben or Josh are not familiar, and she actually spends a good amount of time in New Zealand, ironically, so my streaming partner is part Canadian New Zealander.
Epic. Do you want to take that one first then, David? What's the best evidence?
No, yeah, she asked that for Ben. She knows what I think on that.
Oh, I know she might know that, but
I want to hear
and the millions of people on the internet, they want to see it.
Well, I was saying that, because I promote meditation and mental techniques, so that you have to. It's very difficult for a physicalist, and I'm sure, Ben's a rationalist, so we could probably discuss maybe even scientific studies of mantras and meditation, and maybe you've tried martial arts or different yoga things that probably have a source in meditation, but the strongest evidence is the physical phenomenon. People who do rituals in prayer to say, I experience an interaction with the spiritual realm. I have a voice in my head. I have, things that come into my head, desires, thoughts, ideas. And I think that that's the spiritual realm sending me ideas. And that's how I interact with the world. And it corresponds with the way I live my life in terms of not just the rituals and prayers that I say, but also, the theory, I want to be a good person, maybe utilitarian because I believe in karma, and that there is some sort of extra phenomenon that causes the righteous to be rewarded and the wicked to be punished, even if it's very difficult for the eye to discern. Within Judaism, Maimonides, it's a fundamental principle of belief. We're required to believe. I chanted it every morning for years, that the righteous get rewarded and the wicked get punished. Saying that Spinoza was excommunicated because dualism is that important, and so if Ben is basically saying no, I'm sorry, you're delusional. The righteous don't get rewarded and the wicked don't get punished, and I'm saying that I believe they do, and you basically need a dualistic system with some sort of extra force that causes karma and morality to work. So it's something that any given person, low intelligent, high intelligence, uneducated, educated, small child, adult, all have the phenomenon and the experience. And, probably all thought about these issues. What happens when we die? They've had relatives that die. They've probably observed phenomenal experiments that makes more sense according to a spiritual explanation. So I'm sure, Ben is a rationalist in all his beliefs. I'm sure on a regular daily or weekly experience that there's things that happen that even from his own conscious perception would probably make more sense according to a spiritual explanation. And then he might rationalistically be like, oh, don't be insane, Ben. It wasn't something spiritual. There's some better explanation. You just haven't figured it out yet. But so for that, I would say any given person could use their own meditative experience, and you don't need me to produce evidence for you. You need to use your own mind to figure it out for yourself.
So
okay,
for
got
me,
it.
I'm obviously sympathetic with the enlightened, secular, scientific case that I kind of laid out earlier from neuroscience and genetics and morphology. But if I had to pick the silver bullet that I think is just the bane in the side of dualism and pushes us into the monist camp, it's the interaction problem. So I think that the idea that there's this first law of thermodynamics and that it implies a causal closure of the physical universe, I think that's a very powerful reason to think that there's just one kind of stuff in the world. And, the first law of thermodynamics, I think, is just about as well established as any principle in science can be established. And so I just think that the interaction problem, when you understand it in terms of mass energy, just becomes intractable. It's what keeps me in the monist camp. I think it's why the dualist tradition has only had its resurgence within the property dualist tradition, the idea that there's still just one substance, but there's just two properties. Because I think that's largely just driven by the intractableness of this interaction problem. So I think that's the best evidence in support of monism.
Okay. I actually took a note on that when you brought that point up. I'd like to bring it now. I'm going to abuse my position as the moderator again for this.
I'm here for that.
Okay, so look, this is and I'm not gonna take a religious perspective on this. I'm gonna go from simulation hypothesis, right? Let's go pure, like, scientific rebranding of, like, what Duvid introduced as the idea of Maya or illusion, but the simulation hypothesis that, since we can simulate reality inside reality, we have no way of knowing whether we are actually inside a simulation, inside reality, right? And the analogy for that is, I can play Grand Theft Auto, and in Grand Theft Auto, my character can, like, run around, he can fly, he can steal a car, he can blow things up, like, all kinds of things happen with, like, huge amounts of energy exchanges happening in the game, but there's no impact on the energy system where I am. And I experience identifying with that and, seeing the whole realm of that taking place. So could it not be the case that there is some irreducible entity that is experiencing the exchange of energy in the realm of perception, but is separate from it? And in that case, wouldn't that just completely get around this thermodynamics argument that you bring up?
So I don't know. So it'd be this is going to dive into the realm of external world skepticism, kind of, how do we know we're not living in a matrix or our brains in vats?
We are, but yeah. How do we know that we're not?
Yeah, exactly. And so, what are some solutions to these kinds of problems? There's differing views. So without getting too deep in the weeds with that, I would want to focus on the first law of thermodynamics, in the sense that, so, like, let's just assume we are in a simulation, and that one of the rules programmed into this simulation is the first law of thermodynamics. Well, does that help us avoid the interaction problem? I don't know that it does, because it's still part of the rules within that simulation that the net total energy remains constant, and our brains are, closed systems, other than, obviously the energy that we put into them and the energy that it expends, but nothing deviates from the law of conservation of energy. All no mental activity has a sufficient physical cause in embodied brains. So that observation, it just seems like it's an implication of the simulation that we're in, that our mind stuff has to be the same kind of stuff that our bodies interact with, because one of the programmed laws is the first law of thermodynamics. So I don't know, without getting into external world skepticism, I don't know if that sufficiently meets the challenge.
Well, yeah, I mean, you said you don't want to get too deep into the weeds. It is the kind of thing that people talk about when they are deep in the weed, but I'd say the character inside GTA has no way of telling that it's inside GTA, right? So,
sure.
Really, that would tell us that we would not be able to detect it from within inside the simulation.
We don't know if they're conscious or not. We don't know what it's like to be a character in a video game.
Unless that's what's happening to us right now, in which case we definitely know what it's like. Okay, so I have a question for Duvid from the audience here. There are actually two. Let me see if I can find this one that I was going to bring up. Here we go. This one here. It's from Brute Facts Podcast again. David, why do you believe past thoughts on consciousness count as evidence?
That I'll call it the consensus of the greatest minds of history. So, I mean, from a Mosaic biblical perspective, it's kind of like democracy, that Moses says after he passes away, there's going to be, councils of elders, and that you should follow in somewhat of a democratic process the council of elders, and like a concept of sages of the generation that is similar to maybe like Sampradaya and Vedic ideas, where there's these great wisdom traditions had explanations for how these phenomenon work, because God revealed to people through chosen people, whatever form, prophets, acharyas, great wise men, understandings of how these systems work. And so I call like the consensus of the sages, so that there's the problem of empiricism, and it's very difficult to know. We can't really, like one day we'll die and we'll find out, like maybe we'll be reincarnated, maybe there's a heaven and hell, maybe we'll be reincarnated and we won't find out because we'll just be reincarnated and we won't remember, or all these various things that I promote what I call the multiple truth hypothesis, is saying that you can't really have a comprehensive, coherent system that explains everything. It's impossible from an empirical perspective of the limitations of the human mind, the soul being limited in the physical realm. But you can put axioms out like karma. There's karmatic rules of that you could somewhat test, like the Bible says you could test in charity, that when you give to other people, that God makes sure you get in return that back in return, or even from Abrahamic, that you do for Israel, God will return multiple fold, based on just different karmatic formulaic expressions. They're in various traditions that are somewhat testable. And all different traditions have different karmatic formulations, and saying, okay, no, I don't have a complete, comprehensive, coherent philosophy that explains everything, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, or different reasons may be impossible. However, I do believe in this concept of the consensus of the sages, the greatest minds of previous generations. And it's like, okay, Aristotle, Moses, the Talmudic scholars, the Babylonians, a lot of the Egyptians, the Vedic, most believed in the soul, most believed that consciousness. From my survey of history or what I've traveled, that it was pretty common that the consensus of sages for hundreds or thousands of years, from the research I know, was in various forms of dualistic systems. And Ben has a more complete understanding or explanation of the philosophical way to explain these various differentiations. And so that's why okay, we have scientific explanations, like we think that consciousness and thought will arise from the brain. There's a lot of things going on, but then we also have consensus of the sages. So you'd be like, okay, Aristotle and Socrates, and okay, they were just wrong. They don't have to be right on everything. They were great minds. They set up the foundations for the society we live in today. However, in a lot of issues, they were just wrong. And so I say that there is some value, especially in cases of uncertainty. So if it's like gravity or whatever, how you're gonna differentiate levels of knowledge. But in cases of uncertainty, that from a religious perspective, and maybe Theology Unleashed from their own different theological understanding, would also largely agree that in cases of uncertainty, what you should do is go with the consensus of the sages. So okay, I have a spiritual master, and the spiritual master has some method of knowing who the sages of the generation are, and discuss these important issues, and that's who we should go with. And then so like a greater scientific perspective of historically, and maybe Ben knows more about this than me, because he's maybe read a bunch of these famous people. But are you in agreement Ben, that historically the majority of great minds were more in a dualistic spiritual explanation camp?
I think you're muted, Ben.
Maybe. I don't know. So I'm going to be honest and say that I don't really know the history of the monist dualist dialectic, pretty much past Descartes in history. So, for example, I'm not entirely sure how the medievals or the Greeks or the Stoics or the pre-Socratics would approach something like the mind-body problem. And nor do I know how a lot of Eastern traditions would face the mind-body problem. I could guess at some of them, make educated guesses about some of them, but I'm be honest with you, I just don't know the history.
We don't need to guess here. But what about the scientific approach towards, like a consensus of sage concept that, religiously you say we follow consensus, but can you scientifically?
So I think consensus is important for reasons within the philosophy of science, in that the paradigm that you're working with, the tools and that you're going to be working with, the concepts and the methods are going to come from that paradigm. And that paradigm is going to be defined by traditions and elders and, different methods that, string theorists right now are building on the paradigms of quantum mechanics and special relativity theory. So, they're using the tools of their paradigm. Do I think that paradigms are infallible? Certainly not. I think paradigms can shift. That we can have important discoveries and progresses within domains such that older paradigms just become obsolete. So the famous example is Newtonian mechanics and special relativity. So Newton had a picture of the world. That picture worked well for our local conditions, but when we went to more cosmic scales, we started to get little mistakes, and then Einstein's theory of relativity comes on board, fixes those mistakes, and so now the Newtonian picture has been supplanted. So what has happened there? Have we shunned the elders? Have we gone against some sort of principle of, we should stick with the consensus? The consensus was the, Newtonian paradigm. Well, no, it's the paradigm is shifted. We had a big discovery, Einstein and Newton with the movements of Mercury around the sun proved special relativity. It was just one of those events where the paradigm just shifted.
Well, you're the expert. That it's the hard problem of consciousness that remains unsolved. Like I said, that if it's still a hard problem of consciousness, maybe it pays to listen to the ancient sages as long as it's a problem for scientists.
That's a very good point, because the paradigm in the Western analytic philosophy right now is very much physicalism. Physicalism very much dominates the philosophy of mind departments, neuroscience departments, cognitive science are dominated by physicalists. But there is a tradition that is gaining steam, a new dualist tradition, the tradition that we get largely from David Chalmers these days, where the idea of philosophical zombies has really been popularized. This idea that there's these two properties within the world. And so we might be seeing a paradigm shift away from these physicalist methods to this property dualist method. Now, it still remains to be seen. There's still a lot of interesting discussions going on right now. But you're right. It might be that our paradigm shifts back to the traditions of the elders, and that this dualist tradition comes back into prominence.
Epic. Okay, so building on this from here, we've gone from spiritual/scientific consensus to Newton being superseded by Einstein. And then, of course, Einstein was famous, at least in scientific circles, for his opposition to quantum mechanics. and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and he famously said, God does not play dice. So here's a question, and this one's coming in from Arjuna, and he says, quantum physics tells us that matter is at the bottom probabilistic, so it takes no energy for one outcome to materialism rather than another. So how can the conservation of energy argument sustain this? So since your thermodynamics argument against dualism is based on Newton, he's like, we're going to go right past Einstein to Heisenberg. Quantum mechanics says that, you can get multiple outcomes with no energy cost through, this waveform collapse. So how does your argument against the duality, based on such an outdated paradigm as Newton's law of thermodynamics, how do you sustain that with quantum mechanics and this, the observation, the collapse of the waveform, the seeming interdependence of perception and concrete reality, and the zero cost of different outcomes from the quantum level?
So this is a great question that's actually falling into my engineering wheelhouse. So I'm by profession a nuclear engineer. So I refuel nuclear submarines. So nuclear theory is
your bread and butter, literally.
Yeah, a little bit more in my wheelhouse than, say, something like cosmology and relativity theory. So quantum mechanics, I am unaware of any implications of quantum mechanics that say that the collapse of the wave function violates conservation of energy because it takes no energy for one outcome rather than another. I'm not entirely sure where they're getting that. So, for example, uranium-235 that's been enriched, that's being used for power, decays probabilistically by the laws of quantum mechanics, but when it does decay, it releases an alpha radiation, and it does this so that the conservation of energy is not violated. It's when you do your energy balance, everything cancels out. If it didn't do that, then we would have a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. I'm not entirely sure what this questioner is getting at. That maybe they know of some other experiment in quantum mechanics where they've had some observation that seems to violate the first law of thermodynamics. I'm not aware of such an experiment, but I'm not bold enough to say that no such experiment exists yet, because maybe quantum mechanics is weird.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what was behind this question. I'm going to take a stab at it though. What about Schrodinger's cat, the thought experiment, right? You bring up the decay of uranium to an alpha particle, and it's probabilistic when it happens. It has a half-life, so we know 50% of it will decay in that time, but within a shorter period of time, we can't say deterministically if it'll happen or not. But the thought experiment is you put the cat into the box, the detector, if it happens, the cat dies, and then before you open the box and look at the cat, it's neither alive nor dead, but in some kind of superposition of the two, and it relies on some kind of conscious perception of it to concretize the outcome. So doesn't that suggest that there is some irreducible, non-material, observer involved in the interaction?
Maybe not an observer, but it certainly does imply that the uncertainty principle of quantum mechanics is a real feature of reality. So there's a little bit of a popular misconception about Schrodinger's cat, because it's actually not an argument for quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle. Is actually meant to be an argument against the uncertainty principle, to say that to lead to a contradiction, to say that this uncertainty principle, the cat is both dead and alive at the same time in the box, and so that's absurd. So that this uncertainty principle can't be a real feature of the world. But we've certainly come a long way since then, and we know that the uncertainty principle is true. What is the uncertainty principle? So the uncertainty principle is that when we are describing a particle at the quantum level, if we know its velocity, we cannot know its position, and vice versa. If we know its position, we know less about its velocity. and that this is just a fact. And so people often get confused and misled by this idea that, it requires some observer, that some observer is required for this wave function collapse. And that's not entirely accurate, because what the interpretations of quantum mechanics say is that when there are observers trying to observe, if they are observing its velocity, they are going to be uncertain about its location. And if they are observing its location, they're going to be uncertain about its velocity. Observers can't know both at the same time. That's the uncertainty principle. And there's obviously a lot of questions in the philosophy of physics here of what all is implied by this, law of quantum mechanics. What does it all mean? What can we get from this? And those debates rage on today for sure.
I'm not sure if Church of Entropy is still here. I know that Arjun had a few weeks ago Hiridayananda Goswami, and he actually co-hosted the Science of Consciousness conference in Florida with Stuart Hameroff a few years ago. And we talk about constantly quantum mind, the Penrose-Hameroff concept of microtubules being able to harness quantum phenomenon, and they possibly have a materialistic explanation. The Penrose-Hameroff are more a physicalist explanation of consciousness that harnesses quantum potential through microtubules. That's one of me and Jennifer, Church of Entropy's favorite areas of research. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Penrose hypothesis, but we're big fans of that and think that that's one of the best theories on the market right now approaching the hard problem of consciousness.
It's a very interesting topic for me, because my background's in computing. Especially, I love quantum computing, David Deutsch, and I'm an adherent of the Everett many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Awesome. I'm in such good company tonight. I've got engineers and physicists and computer, just philosophy, computer, everything. It's great. I love it.
Power of the internet. Like if you went to your local bar, you probably wouldn't meet us, but there's a handful of us spread out all over the world.
Friday night, we're all on YouTube talking about big questions in philosophy and science. I love it.
Well, we do different things. We're saying this is what we think about while we're doing other things. So you can make YouTube streaming and actually find other people that, because really I've been thinking about this topic in my spare time, probably hours every day for 20 years now.
Yeah, I can't put them away. They're questions. I always heard as a kid, people are like, "Oh, there's questions that'll keep you up at night," and I'm like, "What question could possibly keep me up all night?" And I found them.
So we're at the top of the 2 hours here, and normally what we'd do is we'd ask you to summarize your position, something like that. But I'd like to do something different. Here. So in the because we've gone there now, we're going to go all the way. In the comments, we have Claire Core. She's doing a study about these kind of debates. And this is what she wants to know, and this is the question that I want us to end on from both of you. Here is, why are people interested in discussing these topics? Who are they, and what kind of people are they? So, we started to touch on it, but let's give it to them.
Such a good question. I'll let you go first.
Okay, yes, I'll wrap it into my concluding remarks if you want, and then you could conclude.
Yeah, well, I talked first. That way I'll let you talk last. That's good.
I thought they usually switch it, but whatever's fine, however you want to do it.
Yeah. So the simple answer to the question is philosophy. So this question goes back to Socrates and the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that truth matters. This idea that we can ask questions and we can have right and wrong answers to these questions, and we can discover truth by a love of just conversation with our friends. And that part of what a good life consists in is having really good friends and family and being able to discuss with them big questions of all different types and being able to build friendships and bonds based on this pursuit of truth. So that's my canned philosophy answer to the question. But if I'm giving my personal, I just love it. It's just fun. It's just a hobby. I like video games. I like playing trading card games. I like writing. I like reading philosophy. I like having debates. It's just what I do. It's my anti-drug, I guess you could say. I just have fun doing it.
Yeah, great. And I'm glad you showed up. I enjoyed preparing for this, and I enjoyed the conversation. I'll enjoy rewatching it later, and definitely your technical terminology is superior to mine. So I'm definitely going to try to watch it back and you try to master at least the framing the technical terminology. I'm generally a spiritualist. I enjoy thinking about things, solving mysteries. And these kind of like deep questions. Why do I desire what I desire? Why do I do what I do? How could I be a better person? Like Ben says, truth matters. What is truth? How do we go about discovering truth? What are these voices in my head? What are these drives? Why do I desire to do bad things? Why can't I perfect myself? All these various things that I took a religious journey of character refinement and also the question of the immortal soul. What happens after we die? Reincarnation, hell, Messiah, redemption. I believe in these concepts, and they're esoteric and spiritual. So you could find religious people and do our rituals and practice, but an actually systematic explanation of it is very difficult because most academic studies are physicalist, and they don't really want to a scientific approach to spiritualism. So my hope is, internet, and I've been doing this for a while, is to find interesting people and people who think about these things and form communities of people that put research into it. And even, I have what I'm calling the multiple truth hypothesis, like a framework that, maybe the hard problem of consciousness is solvable to some extent. And even what Ben said, that, kind of exciting that there might be schools for a return to dualism, where we could discuss axiomatic theories of karma or axiomatic theories about systems, how good is rewarded and evil is punished. And so that's why I do it. And I mentioned Arjun, in Vedic culture, I went to yeshiva, Talmud, Pilpul. A debate is part of the religious culture. That the truth matters, and debate is the only method to get to the truth. And usually the best debates are between people of opposing schools. So there's people that I've already made my mind. I'm a grown man and part of movements. But I was young once, and I thought about these things, and I had to decide, should I go to Israel and study? Should I, go to this school or that school? Should I try Bhakti Yoga? Should I, experiment chanting Hare Krishna? Or should I, go to this sweat lodge or this ritual? And I decided to take a dualistic approach to life, that I believe these things work. And in my own mind, I'm constantly thinking about these dualistic methods while having engineering training and knowing from a scientific perspective. So that's my aim in this. And I enjoyed the conversation with Ben, and I assume that he's also thought up quite a bit about dualistic systems, even if he's a physicalist at the end of the day. And also like interfaith. See my YouTube channel, I love doing interfaith. And I think from the scientific testing level of karma, interfaith is a very good way to somewhat test karmatic principles. Like, say even Ben from his physicalist perspective, say, does he essentially accept the ahimsa principle? And it sounds like, yeah, he basically thinks the ahimsa principle is largely a truism. And, that's generally that most traditions and so some sort of scientific, or Freemasonic, or however you want to term it, that I love from a Kabbalistic, like a unification, like that eventually all people, all men will stand shoulder to shoulder, worshiping the same God in our various different ways, even though what Ben said in the opening, like it can't be that this is true and that's true, because it's a direct contradiction. But he's saying have faith in the sages that somehow truth is going to unify these paradoxes. So I love doing it. Happy to participate. I appreciate Arjun inviting me and Josh moderating, hosting this, and Ben, I'm going to make sure to watch this back to make sure I try to understood all your arguments, and maybe we shall meet again in another debate. And I think that people that listen to me regularly will, even if they're on the spiritual camp, will appreciate how you outlined and framed in the philosophical, at least framing, that a lot of people, like including myself, it's hard to frame what do I actually believe. What is the difference between my belief system and other people's belief systems, and what are the implications of that. So have a great weekend. It's almost Sabbath here in Metro Detroit, so Shabbat Shalom to anyone who celebrates Sabbath. Hare Krishna, and thanks a lot.
Awesome. May we meet again in this life, or if David is correct, in the next. Simish Ben Said says, great stream, theme focus, 2 point, and of course, excellent, knowledgeable speakers. Thank you. So thank you to everyone who tuned in to the live stream today, and to the millions of people, some of them yet unborn, who are going to see this on the internet archives. And on behalf of everyone watching, and from me personally, thank you, David and Ben, for taking the time to come and share your accumulated wisdom and the deep thinking that each of you has done on this subject with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, David. Thanks again for having a great discussion with me.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was pretty friendly. I was prepared for like a blood sports, kind of like if you said nihilism, like, yes, I am a nihilist. But you seem to adhere to the ahimsa principles. So I think it was, just a more paid to have a more friendly philosophical, like interfaith or type conversation that someone in university, the ones I look back to, that one I enjoyed in university.
Yeah, that question that someone came up with in the audience, why aren't you a theist yet? It was kind of like right there. It was like, yeah, you seem so close.
That's a question I get quite frequently. I think it's something of a joke among my apologist friends to just be like, why don't we just keep asking Ben, why isn't he a theist yet?
Right, because he's like basically got the whole thing going on, except with
the best of both worlds. He's like, he gets the best of both worlds, all the benefits of theism. He is philosophically.
It means a lot though, that I'm able to get good discussion on both sides of the aisle, respect on both sides of the aisle, and make enemies on both sides of the aisle. So
yes, all rounder. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you so